So I went back to school at Sacramento State in their doctorate program in educational leadership. And while I was at the school that I currently work at, I was watching a lot of my students, noticing a lot of our high school students left high school and didn't continue on with their education. I became kind of curious about what some of the barriers were for students accessing further education. So when I got into graduate school, I really wanted to look at issues of rural students and access to higher education and what prompted students to move on to higher education or prevented them from doing so. So every time I had an opportunity to set my own research, I was looking at issues of rural college access. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Um, Actually, maybe I'll go there right now. Before I get into the research and the data, I want to pause. I put the slide in here to remind myself to do this, to clarify a little bit on terminology around dual enrollment, because there are a lot of terms that are used to talk about dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment, early college credit, tons of different terms, and they mean different things to different people. For the purposes of this research and this presentation, when I use the term dual enrollment, I'm talking about any time a high school student is taking a college class and getting both high school and college credit for it. So it could be on the high school campus, it could be on the college campus, it could be online. What I'm not including in that is AP and IB courses and other sort of credit by exam type courses are not included when I'm talking about dual enrollment. It's strictly students taking a high school students taking a college class. All right, so now I'll start to dive a little bit into the research, the context for this. As I said, in my grad program, every chance I got, I started diving into looking at, what do we know about rural students and college access? And it turns out that although about 20% of high school students live in rural areas, there's relatively little research on rural students and college access. But from the literature that does exist, there's a few themes that emerge. The first is overall rural students have lower post-secondary attainment than non-rural students, and that's been shown in various different studies. There is some evidence that that gap has been closing over the last, the decade prior to 2018, but there still are differences in post-secondary attainment for rural and non-rural students. Another thing that is really clear in the research is that rural students have different post-secondary enrollment patterns. They're much more likely to start their higher education at a community college rather than a four-year institution. Rural schools often have limited access to AP courses and other advanced coursework, partly because of just the population density. Rural schools often don't have enough students to sustain, calculus, physics, and a bunch of different AP classes. So rural schools often use their community colleges as a way to give students access to higher education. And for that reason, dual enrollment might be particularly important for rural students. Yet despite the differences in post-secondary enrollment patterns and this key role that dual enrollment plays in rural schools, there is, to my knowledge, no existing empirical research examining dual enrollment outcomes specifically for rural students. And when I first started, presenting, on this research, I used to qualify that statement a little bit because I found it hard to believe. It's like really nothing. But as I dove into my literature review, really, there's nothing that I know of. If anybody knows of any peer-reviewed empirical research, please let me know, because I would love to read it. But I was not able to find anything. Before I dive into dual enrollment, I just want to pause. And does anyone have any questions? I'll take a question or two if there is one about what the research says on rural students and college access. So this wasn't, my research. This was just from my lit review. And like Kim and Megan said at the beginning, feel free to put questions in the chat. And then when I pause, one of them will bring the questions into the room so we can address it. So hearing no questions, I'll dive into the research evidence for dual enrollment. So in contrast to the very limited research on rural students and college access, there is actually quite a bit of research on dual enrollment in general, just not specific to rural students. And I want to pause and maybe back up for a second. So there is some research on rural students and dual enrollment. It tends to be more qualitative research, looking at rural students' experiences in dual enrollment, the reasons rural students choose to participate in dual enrollment, but nothing really around rural student outcomes.
We do have one question, and that is about whether students are taking classes online or in person. And I don't know if there's any information.
The answer is yes. Students, all students are, and rural students in particular, are participating in dual enrollment in all possible iterations. It could be online, it could be on the high school campus, or it could be students going to the college campus. All of those things are happening. So looking at the research evidence for dual enrollment, there is a large and growing body of evidence showing that dual enrollment is associated with positive post-secondary outcomes for students overall. And this includes higher probability of post-secondary enrollment, persistence 2 and 3 years after they enroll in college, higher first-year college GPA, and higher probability of attaining a degree for students who participate in dual enrollment. We see these positive outcomes at both community colleges and four-year institutions, which is important for rural students because, as I said previously, they're much more likely to begin their college at a community college. Several researchers have looked into whether those results differ by subgroup. So looking at results for historically marginalized student groups, whether that's racial or ethnic groups, socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And when looking by different subgroups, there are some conflicting results in the research. Taylor in 2015 found that although all students seemed to benefit from dual enrollment, the benefits were smaller for low-income students and students from historically minoritized groups. More recent research from Lee and Henenberger has shown either similar results or actually stronger results for historically marginalized groups. So the jury's still out on that one. When I get into my data, I'll have a little bit to add to that conversation. One thing that is very clear in the research, though, is participation in dual enrollment varies greatly with race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Students who are taking advantage of dual enrollment opportunities are more likely to be white and more likely to be more affluent than the general student population. In terms of geography, rural schools are more likely to offer dual enrollment opportunities, and rural students are more likely to participate in dual enrollment. So, as I said, dual enrollment is often filling that gap that rural schools have in terms of opportunities for advanced coursework. As a high school, I maybe can't create a calculus class for my 5 students who need it or whatever the class is, but I can send them to the class that's already happening at the community college or connect them with online classes at the community college. So any general questions on what the research says, what the prior research says on dual enrollment?
There is a question about whether or not gender was one of the subgroups.
So I haven't seen any research on differential outcomes by gender. There is definitely strong evidence that female students participate at much higher rates in dual enrollment than male students. So that's another one of that, how the participation in dual enrollment varies.
I have a question. For that differential results for subgroups, you mentioned that Lee and Henenberger found, you said the same or stronger. Do you mean stronger as in they confirmed that like low income and minority students were participating were benefiting less, or that it was stronger as in it reversed that?
There was a stronger impact of dual enrollment for those student groups. So
that conflicts.
Those groups benefited more from dual enrollment than more affluent students.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking that point of clarification.
Sorry, there's also a question about types of rurality, and I can't remember if I saw any of that in your slides or not, but rural fringe versus rural distant versus rural remote.
When I talk about my research, I'll get
Okay,
to
that's what I
what I'm talking about when I say rural. So yeah, that's definitely, as everybody in this room I'm sure knows, a huge complicating factor. The purpose of my study was to analyze the relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary outcomes for rural students. And I kind of did this in two steps. My first research question looked at just dual enrollment and how that was related to post-secondary enrollment persistence and first-year GPA. That's what I covered in my dissertation. In this presentation, I'll really only be talking about enrollment, post-secondary enrollment, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end about persistence and GPA also. So first, I just looked at the relationship, strictly bivariate relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment. And then I added socioeconomic status into my model to see if that relationship varied once I took into account student socioeconomic status. The second part of my research, I looked at, okay, so I might establish this relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment, but a lot of the factors that are correlated with post-secondary enrollment are also associated with students taking dual enrollment classes. So the question is, well, we'll get there when we get there, but for the second part of the research, I added a bunch of control variables that controlled for students' educational expectations, prior academic achievement, some demographic characteristics, and the cultural capital, which was measured by the parents' educational aspirations for their children. The data I used was from the high school longitudinal study, which is a large nationally representative sample of students who were in 9th grade in 2009. I should point out the full sample was nationally representative. The rural subsample may not, almost certainly wasn't. So it was a nationally representative sample, and then I compared rural versus non-rural, but it wasn't weighted to be nationally representative of rural students. So that's one limitation of my study. The data, the base year survey was in 2009 when students were in 9th grade. And then there was a follow-up 2 years later when students were in 11th grade. It looks like 3 years because it was fall of 9th grade and spring of 11th grade. An additional survey in 2013, right after most students had graduated from high school. It included a high school transcript review, a second follow-up 3 years after high school graduation, and a post-secondary transcript review. So across 9 years, a whole bunch of different waves of data collection. It was a really sort of complex and nuanced study with a ton of variables and a very rich source of data. I'm really excited there was a third follow-up that actually already happened. That data just came out earlier this year and has the data on student outcomes. I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but I am super excited to dive back into it. So yes, let's talk about rural. So what are we talking about when I talk about rural? I was limited to the public use data. So what I really would have liked to have used was the sort of the rural, distant, and remote, or rural and town, distant and remote, so kind of far away from urban centers. I didn't have access to that data. But in the National Center for Education Statistics, because this was an NCES data set, they used the locale codes for rural, town, city, and suburb, the classic NCES data sets, data tags, excuse me. And in this sort of classification, the town category represents what they call urban clusters with populations of 2,500 to 50,000, which obviously is a huge range. It is a little bit problematic. In the documentation, they state that most towns actually have a population of less than 10,000. And as I was digging into my research, this was kind of personal to me because I was interested in finding out how dual enrollment impacted rural students. And then as I started to read this documentation, I realized that under their classification system, the students I'm working with are not rural students. Like I said, I live in this geographically large but very sparsely populated county in Northern California. I think the largest town in Siskiyou County has like 7,000 people. The whole county is rural, but we have a lot of towns that are about 3,000 people, and all of the schools are in the towns, of course, right? So that got me thinking, and I dug into it a little bit more. When I looked at the descriptive statistics, I saw there were really strong similarities between the rural and town students in several of the variables that were really kind of central to my study, including educational expectations, post-secondary enrollment, dual enrollment participation, and some other things. And when I did some analyses just to, check to make sure that I was understanding this right. And there was no statistically significant difference in the distribution of these variables between rural and town students, but it was clearly different from the city and suburb students. So for the purposes of my study, I combined rural and town subgroups. So when I talk, I try to be specific and say rural town, but if I just say rural, I'm talking about both the rural and town students in this study. All right, so getting into the analysis, for anybody who cares, I used multinomial logistic regression in Stata 17 using a complex survey design and balanced repeated replication. So that multinomial logistic regression, what that does is that I can feed all of these variables into my model, and it gives me an odds ratio, which basically tells me the change in the odds of a given outcome, in this case, post-secondary enrollment. So how do the odds of a student enrolling in post-secondary education change if they participated in dual enrollment? So looking at just the bivariate model and then throwing in SES as a third variable. So in this first column here, I'm only looking at dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment. So for rural and town students, the odds ratio for post-secondary enrollment for students who participated in dual enrollment is 2.21, meaning basically participation in dual enrollment doubles the odds of a student enrolling in post-secondary education at a community college, and then it increases the odds by a factor of 3.5, so a little bit more than tripling the odds for enrollment in a four-year institution. For city and suburb students, there was no significant relationship between dual enrollment and enrollment in a community college after high school, but it about doubled the odds of students enrolling in a four-year institution after high school. When I added socioeconomic status, because I was interested in seeing, do those results still hold if I control for a student's socioeconomic status. And what I found was basically things didn't change much. The odds ratio decreased a little bit from 2.21 to 2.05 for two-year institutions and 3.56 to 3.03 for four-year institutions. But it remained significant and roughly the same order of magnitude. Same with city and suburb students. It didn't really substantially change anything in that relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment. However, like I said, the question is, are students more likely to enroll in college because they took a dual enrollment class, or is dual enrollment selecting for the students who are already planning on enrolling in college anyway? So are we just seeing that relationship because the students that want to go to college are taking the dual enrollment classes? So to explore that question, before I move on, let me just kind of sum up those last results. So looking at just dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment, I found that dual enrollment was significantly associated with an increased odds of post-secondary enrollment in both two-year and four-year institutions for rural and town students. It about doubled the odds for two-year institutions, tripled the odds for four-year institutions. But it was only associated with an increased odds of enrollment in four-year institutions for city and suburb students. And I didn't really see much difference in those relationships when I controlled for socioeconomic status. So now I wanted to look at that, is this a selection effect, or is dual enrollment actually responsible for increasing the odds of enrollment in post-secondary education? And the design of my study, I can't definitively answer that. I can't, establish a causal relationship, but it gives, if I control for some of these other factors, especially prior student achievement, that gives me a little bit more confidence that I really am seeing an effect of dual enrollment. So the additional variables that I threw into the model as some controls, I already had socioeconomic status. I included a 9th grade GPA as a measure of prior academic achievement. And I chose 9th grade GPA because dual enrollment can have an impact on GPA, and I really wanted it measured before students had engaged significantly in dual enrollment. I also controlled for student sex, race, ethnicity, math self-efficacy, the students' educational expectations in 9th grade. Again, in 9th grade, because ideally dual enrollment will impact a student's educational expectations. So I wanted that measured before they started participating in dual enrollment. So students in 9th grade were asked, as things stand now, how far do you think you'll get in education? And the possibilities were high school or less, I don't know, some college, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, or a PhD or professional degree. Parents were asked a similar question about their aspirations for their student, saying, if there were no barriers, how far in school would you like your student to get? Not how far they expected them to get, but how far they would want them to get. And then I looked at whether students were attending a public or a private high school. So when I threw all of these control variables in there, what I found was that dual enrollment was still associated with increased odds of post-secondary enrollment for rural and town students, but not for city and suburb students. So that relationship for city and suburb students between dual enrollment and college enrollment in a 4-year university was no longer significant. For rural and town students, there was still a significant association between the two, but the magnitude was a little bit lower. The odds ratio is 1.5, which means it increased the odds of enrollment by about 50% in both 2-year and 4-year institutions. And so unlike, when I was just looking at the dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment, where there seemed to be a stronger influence on enrollment in 4-year institutions, once I included, and I think it was really the 9th grade GPA, the prior academic achievement, then I didn't see a difference between enrollment in 2-year and 4-year institutions. So increased likelihood of enrollment in college overall, but no difference between 2-year and 4-year institutions. Okay, I'm gonna pause there because I just threw a lot of data at you. So any questions or clarifications?
There is a question about whether there's research about differences in post-secondary outcomes based on the type, like if they took the dual enrollment class at a community college versus online or at the high school.
There is, not for rural students, but in that general body of research, I have seen some research into outcomes based on whether it's on the high school campus, whether it's on the college campus, whether it's online. In general, mixed results. Some studies have shown a stronger outcomes when the classes are on the college campus. Some have shown stronger outcomes when it's on the high school campus. I see the same thing when you look at academic versus career technical education courses. Again, it's the mixed results and some conflicting results. I think a lot of that has to do with when I read through those studies, most of those aren't large national studies. So it might be, this one is in Tennessee and this one's in, Florida. And there are some really big differences between states in how dual enrollment is implemented. So it's a little bit hard to draw conclusions from that because is it, whether it was on the college campus versus the high school campus, or whether it was because this study is in Tennessee and this one's in North Carolina, and the differences in the dual enrollment policies. So kind of a non-answer. There is research on it, but conflicting results. One thing that California has done a lot of research on looking at is the makeup of dual enrollment courses. And when the courses are on the high school campus, you see less of those disparities in enrollment based on race, income, and socioeconomic status. So that is one thing that's, you know, sort of coming clear in the research about where those classes are. All right, so a quick summary of what I found about dual enrollment outcomes by geography. And I didn't address this on the last slide, but I was also interested in enrollment patterns because I was kind of interested in whether dual enrollment would shift that for rural students to make them more likely to enroll in a four-year university. So what I found in terms of overall post-secondary enrollment, dual enrollment increased the odds of post-secondary enrollment overall for rural and town students, but there was no significant relationship in overall enrollment for city and suburb students. When I dug into a little bit more the enrollment patterns, so were students more likely to enroll in a four-year university versus their local community college, there was no significant difference for rural and town students. They were more likely to enroll in college versus not enroll, but the impact on two-year and four-year enrollment was basically the same. City and suburb students, it was exactly the opposite. There was no significant relationship with overall enrollment, but the students who did enroll, students who had participated in dual enrollment were more likely than non-dual enrolled students to enroll in a four-year versus a two-year institution. And then persistence for rural and town students, I found no significant relationship. This is in the full model where I include all the control variables. No significant relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary persistence 3 years after enrolling in college. But for city and suburb students, there was a significant positive relationship between dual enrollment and persistence. So this left me scratching my head, and I went back and dug through my research like so many times, looked at my model to see, is there something in the model that is causing these results to be almost exactly opposite? But no, I looked at it several ways, and the results were pretty consistent. A couple other interesting things that came out of this research. Again, I was very interested in how this dual enrollment outcomes varied with socioeconomic status. So when you're doing the multinomial logistic regression, it calculates the odds ratio rather than a change in probability because the specific change in probability depends on the specific values of all of the variables in the model. So what this graph is showing you is I was looking at the change in probability of post-secondary enrollment for students who participated in dual enrollment at different levels of socioeconomic status, holding all other variables kind of at their average value. So if you look at, you know, for holding everything else constant and only changing socioeconomic status, how does this relationship vary? Socioeconomic status in this study was a composite variable that included family income, education level of both parents. If there was a single parent, obviously there was only one parent in there. If there were two parents in the household, it took both of their education levels into account. And then there was also an index of sort of career status was part of this socioeconomic status index also. Right here at 0, that's like students of average socioeconomic status. Negative would be lower socioeconomic status, positive higher economic status, as you might imagine. These lines, the red and green lines, are the probability of enrollment in a 2-year or 4-year institution, respectively. And the blue line is the probability of no post-secondary enrollment. So if you look at this point here down at negative 0.09, that's a 9% decrease in the probability of a student not enrolling in college. So you kind of have to turn that around in your head. It's a 9% increase in the probability they're going to enroll in college. So overall, the average effect was about a 6% increase in the probability of post-secondary enrollment. But for students at the lower end of socioeconomic status, it was up to 8 or 9% increase in probability. For students at the higher end of socioeconomic status, is more like 2 to 3% increase in the probability. Obviously, these are some kind of huge error bars, but these differences were statistically significant by socioeconomic status. So students at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum had a higher increase in the probability of post-secondary enrollment than wealthier students, which kind of makes sense because, you know, what we know about the relationship between socioeconomic status and post-secondary enrollment. These, you know, at this end, these are very wealthy students. They were probably planning on going to college anyway. This next graph shows the same thing, but by ninth grade GPA. So again, very large error bars here at the lower end, but students with lower ninth grade GPA saw at least as great, probably a higher change in the probability of post-secondary enrollment associated with dual enrollment. So students with very low, you know, 1.0, 1.5 ninth grade GPA actually saw on average a 10% increase in the probability of post-secondary enrollment if they participated in dual enrollment classes. Let me, any questions on any of that before I move into sort of the final bit of my information here?
There is one question that it's kind of, I'll just ask it. Do you happen to know whether at rural schools that also offer AP or IB, does the post-secondary enrollment behavior of students who opted for dual enrollment instead change?
I do not know that. That is a really interesting question.
That's
What I have seen, the research I've seen in looking at dual enrollment and AP is a lot of times students will do both. So it's a little bit hard to separate it out. Unless you can look at, you know, opportunity, right? Schools that have AP versus schools that have dual enrollment where students are forced to choose one or the other.
Can I ask a question also?
Yeah.
I missed with the red and green on those charts that are in the positive half.
Uh-huh.
Does that say that dual enrollment lowers a student's probability of enrolling in 2 or 4-year institutions? Because that seems
No.
counterintuitive.
No. So this is the probability of enrolling in a 2-year institution. So positive means increased probability. Probability of enrolling in a 4-year institution. The only reason this one is backwards because this is the probability of not
No
enrolling at
enrollment.
all.
Great. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. But no, these are positive. You saw that right. Okay, before I wrap up and talk about the implications, I do want to dig a little bit into the student educational expectations. As I said, there was a question for students, you know, as things stand now, how far do you expect to get in your education? And rural students were more likely than city and rural and town students were much more likely than city and suburb students to say they didn't know when they were asked that question in ninth grade. Now, a lot of the prior research would predict that students that don't have clear post-secondary plans coming into high school are significantly less likely to enroll in post-secondary, you know, to go on to enroll in college after high school. That was not the case for rural students. So it turns out rural students who answered, I don't know, to that question in ninth grade were just as likely to enroll in post-secondary education as those who expected to achieve a bachelor's degree or higher. And that's regardless of dual enrollment status. City and suburb students, it kind of followed that, the expected pattern, where students who came in without clear post-secondary expectations were significantly less likely to go on to college than those who came in thinking they wanted a bachelor's degree or higher. And I'm going to come back to this in a moment. But first, I want to quickly kind of sum up the findings from this study on the full model. So this is the model that includes all of those control variables. So I found that even after controlling for prior student achievement, demographic factors, students' educational expectations, their parents' educational aspirations, and whether they attended a public or a private school, I found that dual enrollment was associated with an increased odds of post-secondary enrollment for rural and town students. So that I think is an important finding in and of itself because nobody had really looked at that before. So that even though we have all this data on dual enrollment and post-secondary outcomes overall, because of different post-secondary enrollment patterns, because of different you know, aspects of education in rural areas, it wasn't really clear that that also applied to rural students. And I found that it does indeed. Also, interestingly, the relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary outcomes appears to be different for rural town and city suburb students after controlling for all these student level variables. Um, Dual enrollment did not appear to change enrollment patterns for it, so it increased the likelihood that students would enroll in college, but didn't seem to change enrollment patterns. The increase in probability of post-secondary enrollment associated with dual enrollment was larger for students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and also larger for students with lower ninth grade GPA. Okay, so that prompts the question, but why? And I have to be clear that my research can't definitively answer this question. I have some ideas, but now I'm moving into kind of conjecture rather than solid empirical, rigorous study. So one thing that I keep thinking about when I wonder why I'm seeing these differences is what I just showed about the student educational expectations. It appears that rural students are entering high school really truly undecided about well, they're more likely to enter high school truly undecided about, what they want to do with their life after high school. So I think that opens an opportunity for dual enrollment to kind of change their mind about post-secondary enrollment in a way that it might not for city and suburb students who generally are coming in with more well-defined ideas about what they want to do after high school. I also wonder, given the fact that that relationship between dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment disappeared when I included all the control variables, that it makes me wonder if what I'm seeing with city and suburb students is really a selection effect, that the students who are taking dual enrollment in the city and suburb environments are more likely to be the ones that were going to go to college anyway. Whereas it's maybe a broader base of students who are a more general group of students taking dual enrollment in rural settings because it's one of the few options for higher, for advanced coursework. So the implications of this study, as I see it, is that dual enrollment can be a tool for increasing equity and access to higher education for rural and town students. I think we need to be careful, though, given the differences in dual enrollment participation. One of the things that this process of this deep dive into the research kind of challenged my thinking on dual enrollment. I was and still am a big fan of dual enrollment, but now I kind of take that with a cautionary note that dual enrollment is great for students, for individual students, but if we're seeing these big disparities in who's participating in dual enrollment, and we're trying to use it as a tool to increase access, if access to dual enrollment itself is not evenly distributed, there's the danger that we're just concentrating educational advantage among already advantaged students. And so this equity strategy may be backfiring to the extent that we're concentrating that advantage. So to address that, dual enrollment policies really need to identify and remove barriers to access for socioeconomically disadvantaged students and other historically marginalized student groups. One of the things that jumped out to me looking at that data on the GPA is a lot of dual enrollment policies limit access. You have to have a 3.0 GPA. But when we limit access based on GPA, we might be excluding a whole bunch of students who really could benefit the most. And to the extent that GPA is correlated with these other factors, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, there are some other equity issues in there with limiting access based on GPA. I did find significant results, significant association between dual enrollment and post-secondary enrollment, but those results were pretty modest, about at most a 10% increase in the probability of enrollment. So dual enrollment clearly is not a magic bullet for fixing issues in access to higher education. It needs to be combined with other initiatives to increase equitable access to higher education. And finally, thinking about the role that dual enrollment plays in rural schools, and it really is kind of a key feature and an important tool that rural schools use. I know that some colleges and universities weigh AP classes more favorably than dual enrollment. So it's something I think colleges and universities should think about when they're looking at access for rural students is that um, dual enrollment might play a special role in rural schools that is different from how it functions in city and suburb schools. Okay, my final thoughts. This is my last slide, and then I'll open it up for questions. When we're designing dual enrollment programs, some of the things we need to think about are equitable outreach and recruitment. So making sure that we are reaching out to all students and making sure all students are aware of the benefits of dual enrollment. Because if we just sort of throw it out there saying, hey, we've got this great opportunity to take college classes if you're interested, I think what we typically see is the more advantaged students, more affluent students are going to be taking advantage of those opportunities. And some students who really could benefit might not be thinking that it's really for them. And that, I think we have to be careful with some gatekeeping opportunities. I've had a lot of talk with teachers at my school. We just started an early college high school program this year. And, students are thinking about, oh, I need to tell this kid because he's such a great student. He's got a 4.0, or this student, she's always talking about college. This would be a great opportunity for her. And yes, it would be. And, our friend over here with the 2.5 GPA, who's never mentioned college, this could be a life-changing opportunity for him, right? It could change his trajectory. And we need to make sure that he hears about this and understands the benefits too. And we're not just recruiting students who are already more advantaged. There are in current dual enrollment practice a lot of what's often referred to as random acts of dual enrollment, where students just take a class, some random class that they may be interested at the college. That is not as beneficial to students as having coherent pathways that are leading students to a degree or certificate or some specific outcome. And as we are extending dual enrollment opportunities to more students, it's really important to have embedded supports at the high school. You can't just, our friend over here with the 2.5 GPA, we can't just throw him into a college class and hope for the best. We need to make sure he understands how to contact the professor if he gets into trouble, how to take advantage of support services at the college, how to ask for help from his high school staff, which also points to the need for strong collaboration between high school and college partners, because the college faculty don't necessarily understand the ecosystem of a high school and the needs of high school students. And high school faculty and staff don't always understand the expectations of the college. So those two partners need to work really closely together in supporting students. And then finally, if we want to use this as a tool for opening up more equitable access to higher education, we need to be thinking about what are the barriers for historically marginalized student groups and removing those. Those could be things like fees for classes, having to buy books and supplies, transportation. So to the extent that we can, making sure that we're removing those barriers so it really is open to everybody. One thing before I open it up for questions that I wanted to address, this was a question that came in with one of the registrations. Somebody was asking about what are the implications of dual enrollment for financial aid, academic standing, and other things. I think somebody had mentioned they were encouraging students to do more dual enrollment classes, and the college was saying, hey, wait a minute, there's some things you need to think about. So one of the things that we talk to our students about as they are starting this dual enrollment process is really thinking about, what is your end goal? Because there are some implications. So if students take a bunch of classes and don't pass, obviously those grades are on their college transcript and are going to impact their college GPA for the rest of their college career. If students either fail classes or withdraw from too many classes, it can affect their academic standing. It's possible for students, like if they attempt 3 or 4 classes and only pass one of them, that they could enter college after high school already on academic probation, which would really suck. So students need to be aware of, if you take this class, you need to be committed, you need to be aware of the drop dates, you need to know when to drop it. And if you get that W on your transcript once or twice, probably not a big deal. If it starts happening all the time, that could be a problem. And if students don't know that, they might be racking up all these W's that could cause problems later down the line. The impact on federal financial aid, a lot of students and families don't know this, but there is a federal financial aid unit cap. it's typically 150% of the minimum credits required. So if you're in a degree program that requires 120 credits, if you hit 180, you might find yourself cut off from federal financial aid. And that's units attempted, not units completed. So if students are failing classes or withdrawing from classes or taking a bunch of random classes that aren't leading them anywhere, they might find themselves hitting up against that federal financial aid cap, which I can tell you from personal experience is no fun. It wasn't dual enrollment for me. I started in one major, switched schools, switched majors, took a lot of ECE classes because I was teaching preschool for a while, and did my last year of undergraduate with no financial aid. And it took me, I'm not kidding, like 15 years to pay off the credit cards from that last year of college. So, so these are things that students need to know. And what I tell students is, as long as you've got these coherent pathways that are leading students to a goal, it's probably not going to be a problem. In our pathways, they're all based on the general ed requirements for our California State University system. So even if a student changes their major, most of the classes they're taking will apply to the general education requirements they need for any major. And then I think I talked a little bit about the dual enrollment versus AP or IB coursework. But I want to make sure that there's time for questions. So in these slides, which I believe Megan will be sharing, there's a link. If you want to read the full 150-page dissertation, there's the link. Don't feel obligated. Now I want to open it up to questions.
All right, there's a few in the chat, so I'll hit those first. One is, what kind of other initiatives are you referring to in combining them with dual enrollment?
Okay, so that could be increasing counseling opportunities for students and making sure, and not just, I'm the college counselor, come hit me up if you need, if you want to talk, but really proactive outreach early in high school to make sure students are aware of, first of all, how financial aid works. That's something that I've seen a lot of my students have no idea. It's funny because I'll be talking to students and they're saying they're planning on going to our local community college, because of the Siskiyou Promise, it's going to be free. And I know that these are students who qualify for in California, there's a Cal grant, which will pay the full tuition at a UC or a CSU school. I know the student qualifies. They're not planning on living at home. It turns out College of the Siskiyous is not going to be any cheaper than going to UC Davis. And UC Davis probably has more financial aid to help them with their housing costs. And students don't understand that. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, is proactive counseling outreach, wraparound academic supports so that students are getting the academic support they need, making sure that their coursework is relevant so students really understand the relevance of what they're learning, things like that. Upward bound trio programs.
Okay, next, expanding on your last implication, did you learn anything about the policies colleges have for recognizing dual enrollment in their credit/placement policies for matriculating students? I'm curious from the perspective of if rural town students select where they apply based on if they will be able to transfer their dual enrollment credits.
That is an excellent question, and I don't know the answer to that. I didn't specifically look into policies around that. That's more of a kind of on my wish list. Something I'd like colleges to think about when they're looking at applications from rural students, because I have heard that, some colleges don't think highly of dual enrollment credits because there's it depends on, because they're not sure of the quality of the course, whereas with the AP test, they have to pass this test. From the student perspective, when I'm working with our students, we don't have AP courses. We tried doing AP courses a couple times. We had at most 5 students in it. We have had students do online courses, AP courses, and then take the AP test. But our students really enjoy the dual enrollment classes a lot more. They get a lot more out of it. And they're transferable classes if they go to schools in public universities in California.
I asked from a private source when we're here in Pennsylvania, and yeah, just talking to students, and they ask, will you take my dual enrollment? And the answer is no, but we're liberal arts, so there's also not a gen ed they're trying to fill, and kind of My concern is, are we losing students who would be great fits for our campus because they think that they need to be able to transfer their dual enrollment credits and we don't take them. So maybe we're, we are not encouraging them to come because we're not recognizing that pre-existing work. So thank you.
Yeah. So I
Yeah,
think
I feel like I
what
have
I
those conversations too with students about whether or not like some of them are applying to a variety of schools, some like a sophomore, and some where they know they can transfer their 16 credits or whatever to like a state school or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the student. I'm thinking of one student who recently graduated who could have had an associate's degree in physics if he had chosen to, but he didn't want to take the health class and he didn't really care about the associate's degree. He went to Reed College in Oregon, and I think they accepted some of the credits, but not all of them. But that wasn't really important to him. I mean, he was doing it because he wanted to learn the physics,
I
right?
was just going to chime in too from the University of Michigan. I think what we've experienced is sometimes there's a disconnect in thinking about what is and isn't a core academic class. And so I had made a joke in the chat earlier that when I was in 8th grade, I was kind of encouraged or chosen to take a photography class through, through the community college, which I'm not interested in, but I did because it was a dual enrollment opportunity. Um, and I think, students might think like, oh, this is rigorous or this is going to look positive because it's a dual enrollment. But if a student is choosing to enroll in classes that aren't considered core academics, um, then it doesn't necessarily look any better than if they were taking an elective at their high school. At least that's how Michigan assesses it. And so I've had a lot of frustration there. Like, oh, I took this, co-op welding class because I'm interested in engineering, but that's not considered an academic, core class. And so I think that's where we run into some frustration. I don't know if others.
I think I'm glad that you mentioned that, Megan, because we recently had our forestry and natural resources students, one of our career technical education programs, they participated in the forestry challenge. And there was an opportunity for them to get dual enrollment credit through, I think, Feather River College for that. And the teacher was asking me, should I encourage the students, to do this? And my thought was kind of the same as like, well, what is it going to get them? If the students really are interested in forestry and natural resources and going into a career in forestry, then yeah, that probably would help. But for their general college, I mean, this is like a credit and a half from some community college that's probably not going to help them towards any other degree. And they're going to have to get that transcript anytime they apply anywhere. So, I would offer it to them, but I was saying I wouldn't necessarily strongly encourage that, only if it makes sense. And I think that sometimes people think, oh, all dual enrollment is going to be great. But these random dual enrollment classes aren't necessarily beneficial to students. Any other questions?
I think that's it in the chat. Oh, wait, one more. Financially, I definitely have a student I work with who spent more on dual enrollment classes in high school and graduated with her associates than she spent on her bachelor's at U Chicago. I've also heard of students using up their Pell Grants on dual enrollment. Is that something you've seen?
So in California, so one of the things that we're lucky about in California, community college, at least our local community college, and I think this is a statewide thing, do not charge students for dual enrollment classes. There might be some minor fees like, that $2 health fee and the $1 ASB fee. But in general, they don't have to pay the tuition or registration fees for their community college classes while they're in high school. So that's not really an issue here. And they're not using their Pell Grant because they don't need to, because there's no fees for dual enrollment classes. But that's one of those, it's one of those things in that policy, in the partnership between the high school and the college. It's like if there are costs, who is paying those? That's definitely a key consideration, for equity. And I mean, personally, if it were, if there were fees and if students, had to use their Pell Grant to cover those fees, I would be concerned about that and how I was advising students. And, that may or may not be a good idea based on their goals. So kind of a non-answer, but depends on the situation. Because when you're using up your financial aid eligibility, you really want to make sure you're working towards the degree that's going to be meaningful to you. And in, 9th or 10th grade, you might not know what that is. In 11th or 12th grade, you might, and then it might make more sense to use that to get a head start on the degree that you want.
And I think that varies in different states. There's a person that says, I'm confused about how that could negatively impact federal financial aid. In my experience in Vermont, New York, dual enrollment is not connected to federal financial aid.
Yeah, so students aren't using federal financial aid in California either while they're taking the dual enrollment classes. The issue is those classes that they take while they're in high school count towards the unit cap for federal financial aid. So if a student takes a bunch of random, photography, forestry, and one thing that has come up in conversations in my area around dual enrollment is, for a while, the community college was really pushing students to do work study at the college to get college credits. And I was pushing back against that a little bit, like, okay, what is that going to get them? And those are credits now that are going to count towards the federal unit cap. And if, there's students like me that take a while to figure out, what you want to do. So now you've come in to college with, 20 credits that aren't really going in any particular direction. You start in this major and then you switch to another major. So you have a whole bunch more classes you have to take. That could then put you in that situation where you're butting up against the unit cap.
And I think the dual enrollment classes are starting a little earlier than they used to. Like, before, a lot of places it was like they were only doing it senior year, then it was junior and senior year, and now I'm seeing it start to move backwards. So,
and in California right now, there's a big push to push that all the way down to 9th grade.
I do want to note that we're just a couple minutes past time. So maybe if you want to move us to the last little concluding slide, Kim, and then if anyone wants to stay on to chat more one-on-one, we can let other folks go on to their 2 o'clock if they need.
All right, just want to let you all know that our YouTube channel has all of our learning labs on it. This one will be on there as well in the next few days. And you have the list here of all of the prior learning labs that we've done in the last, a couple of years, I believe. It goes back. Thank you all for coming. This is a great session. I mean, we've gotten some feedback in the chat, Alana, but this was I'm encouraged that so many people were interested in a data deep dive. So this is great. And then this is a QR code to join the NACAC Rural and Small Town Interest Group if you are not already a member.
Right, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so much positive feedback in the chat is great.
Yes.
I'm going to take a minute to read.